Steal the Morrow by Jenelle Schmidt. Part of the A Classic Retold series. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. It is because I think so much of warm and sensitive hearts that I would spare them from being wounded. Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist. Chapter 1. Bandits. The carriage rumbled along the road, bouncing lightly. Olifur sat next to his mother, gripping her hand. In his other arm, he held a stuffed animal that had once resembled an elephant, but after 7 years of being loved fiercely by a little boy, now looked like nothing so much as a lumpy gray potato. He whimpered slightly, his eyes fixed on his mother's pale face. She looked so frail, nothing like his energetic, strong mother. The shadows of the trees they were passing swept across her face like a ghostly caress. The shadows terrified him, and he flinched at the way they illuminated the gauntness of her cheeks and the dullness in her eyes. What if she didn't get better? What if the physicians couldn't do any more than their village healer had? She squeezed his fingers gently. "Don't worry, Olifur," she whispered. "Your father will get us to the Sishtal in Melar. The physician there will help me. It's not far now." He nodded, but her reassuring words could not ease the dread coiling like a serpent in his belly. The wagon hit another bump, and his mother moaned. Olifur burrowed into her side with another whimper. She kissed his head. "The builder will care for us," she whispered. "We must always trust him." "Please, builder," Olifur thought. "Please let the physician be able to heal her." He wondered if the builder could hear him. Mama and Papa had often told him that the builder was not the distant, uncaring being that many thought him to be, but Olifur wasn't sure. If the builder really cared, then why had he allowed Mama to get so sick?
"Hold the coach!"
Olifur's eyes flew to the window of their carriage at the sound of the rough voice. He could not see out, not while sitting. His mother's fingers tightened painfully on his, preventing him from rising to peer out the window. The serpent within him tightened its coils as the carriage slowed. Were they being stopped by soldiers? Papa had said that the roads were much safer since the Armagh had conquered the other warlords and brought peace and stability to the realm the year Olifur was born. But there were still pockets of resistance. "Please, my wife is very ill. It is urgent that I get her to the Sishtal." Papa's voice drifted back to them. "We don't have any coin."
"What was you planning on paying the healers with, then?"
the rough voice growled. Papa's voice thinned and lowered, too soft for Oliver's ears to catch, though some of the words carried to him. "Every last coin. Nothing has worked. Our last chance. Please." The carriage jerked as though someone had bumped it forcefully. His mother gave a shuddering moan. "Then we'll just have to take your fine Lathan and carriage. We keep these roads safe, but only for paying customers." Another voice jeered. "But my wife ain't no concern of ours now, is she?" The door to the carriage burst open, and a large face peered in.
"Come on out of there!"
Olifur squeezed his mother's hand so tightly his fingers grew stiff. He glowered at the man.
"Leave my mother alone! She's sick!"
he shouted. The man guffawed.
"This little un's got spirit bale, and the sick woman's in here, like you said."
"Get them both out," a deeper voice called back. The man reached in, his long arm gripping Olifur's mother's ankles as if to slide her straight out of the carriage. Provoked to righteous fury, Olifur sprang at the man with a shout, his small fist swinging at the man's rough face. He never landed the blow. The man's massive paw snatched him up by the front of his shirt, and Olifur hung from his grasp, snarling and kicking helplessly.
"The lad thinks he's a Grimstalker cub,"
the man shouted, a cruel grin spreading across his face.
"Put me down!"
Olifur shouted.
"Gladly."
The man opened his hand, and Olifur dropped heavily to the hard-packed earth. Landing on his back, Olifur's breath exploded out of him painfully, leaving him gasping on the ground. Dismissing the boy, the bandit returned his attention to the woman, yanking her out of the carriage and depositing her in the dust. She let out a weak cry. At this, Olifur struggled to his feet and attacked the man's leg with the only weapon he had. The man shrieked and kicked, prying him away from his leg and shoving him so that he stumbled back and sat on the ground hard.
"Little cubling bit me,"
the man growled. The leader, the one called Bale, chortled. "Never turn your back on a Grimstalker, Kyler, no matter how small it is." Kyler aimed a kick his way, which Olifur only partially dodged. The man's boot connected with his side, knocking him over. Olifur sniffled as tears sprang to his eyes. He scrambled over to his mother, pressing himself against her side. Where was Papa?
"Mama!"
She awkwardly wrapped an arm around him, pulling him close.
"We will be all right, Ollie. The Builder will care for us. Always follow the Builder, my son, no matter what happens."
There was a desperate urgency in her voice that frightened Olifur almost as much as the men looming over them.
"Let us go!"
Papa's voice rang out, and terror gripped Olifur as he saw the tall, dark-haired leader coming to the back of the carriage, shoving Papa ahead of him. He held Papa's arm wrenched behind his back at an odd angle. "We are letting you go," Bale snarled, shoving Papa toward his wife and son. Papa stumbled forward, then gained his balance and whirled.
"You cannot do this,"
he said, his voice low and pleading.
"Please, the boy needs his mother. Please let us go on our way. We just need to get to Melar. We're so close. Leaving us here is the same as killing her."
The bandits merely cackled. Papa's face grew grim and stern, and Olifur huddled against his mother at the sudden fury he saw in his father's expression. A glint of something in Papa's hand caught the sunlight as he dove at the leader. Olifur barely had time to blink. Everything happened so fast. The bandit leader whirled. A hiss split the air. Papa fell limply to the ground without a sound. The dirt near his face turned red. Mama leaped to her feet with a wordless scream and dashed toward Papa with a strength Olifur hadn't seen in her in a long time. Her voice rose into a wail, and she screamed Papa's name over and over. Olifur stared, not sure what had happened. Why did Papa just lie there? Why didn't he get up? Mama hurled something at the bandit leader, something sharp and terrible, that lodged itself in his thin shoulder. With a hiss of pain, the man snarled and spun. He clutched at the knife in his shoulder, pulling it out with a growl. Blood dripped down his shoulder, and the blade shone red. The bandit glared at it for a moment. Then he struck, his hand moving faster than Olifur could track with his eyes. Mama's screaming stopped with a deafening suddenness, and she fell forward onto the ground next to Papa. Olifur stared at his parents. Silently, he urged them to rise, to get up. What had happened to his strong, laughing father? Why did he let these men take their carriage? Why did he lie there on the ground? Why did Mama stare up at the sky, unmoving? A strange sound filled his ears, and it took him a moment to realize it was his own voice, rising in a wailing scream. The bandits turned to stare at him, and Olifur froze, clamping his mouth shut. Fear spiked through him, and he felt himself tremble. He wrapped his arms around his beloved elephant and squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the pain he knew would come. The one called Bale loomed over him, his dark eyes burning into Olifur's memory, his narrow face set in an expression of murderous rage that Olifur knew he would carry with him until the day he died.
"What should we do about the cub?"
Kyler asked.
"Nothing,"
Bale grunted, turning his back on the boy.
"Just leave him out here?"
Kyler asked.
"World don't need another orphan hanging around,"
Bale muttered.
"Let the wilderness be the end of him."
Without another word, the two men climbed into the saddles attached to the backs of their huge Lathan. The beasts rumbled forward on well-muscled legs. Kyler shot Olifur an ugly grin as he grabbed the reins of Papa's carriage Lathan. The gentle beast bellowed mournfully, its scaled sides heaving, but it did not protest as the man began leading the beast and the carriage away.
"Bet the Grimstalkers find you tonight,"
Kyler called out with a harsh laugh.
"Try biting one of them."
They kicked their own Lathan into a trot, and soon they and the carriage disappeared over the next rise, leaving Olifur alone on the road. Tears leaked down Olifur's face as he squeezed his elephant tighter. Mama and Papa still lay unmoving in the dirt, the ground around them turning crimson. As the sound of the lumbering Lathan faded away, the fear coiling inside him released enough for him to approach his fallen parents.
"Mama?"
he whispered through trembling lips.
"Papa, they're gone. You can get up now."
Chapter 2. A Grievous Business. They were dead. Olifur understood this in a distant way that didn't seem real. He understood death. He had once had a pet bird that had died. He had found it lying at the bottom of its cage, and it had taken him a long time to understand that the creature would never wake up again. But this was so much more painful than that had been. This throbbing ache in his heart that clawed its way up his throat and burned in his eyes could surely never be comforted or diminished. He knelt in the dust and sobbed. For hours he knelt there, unaware of anything around him, unconscious of the sun slipping away, heedless of anything other than the fact that his world had just ended, and he had nothing. When he had exhausted his entire store of tears, Olifur sat frozen and numb, staring at the bodies that used to be his parents. His entire being felt hollow, drained. As the sky above him darkened, the air cooled, and he shivered. Olifur finally rose to his feet and looked around. Night was drawing near. The trees of the small wood they had been traveling through loomed above him like ominous giants on one side of the road, and a jagged cliff rose on the other. A good place for an ambush. Numbly, he looked at his parents. They should be buried. As young as he was, he knew this. In a sort of distant way, he remembered his father helping him bury the bird. But he had no shovel, no way to properly put them to rest. He sniffled as tears sprang back to his dry eyes. Large boulders lay scattered at the base of the cliff. Perhaps he could set them over his parents' bodies? Slowly, Olifur made his way over to the base of the cliff and tried to pick up a boulder. His arms strained, but he could not lift it. Dejectedly, he sat down, his eyes burning once more. After another few minutes, Olifur rose and chose a smaller rock. Struggling to lift it, he carried it to the road and laid it next to his mother. Then he slowly returned to the cliff for another stone. It took him all night. Back and forth, step after step, stone after stone. The weight of them piled up on his shoulders, bowing them. even as he stacked the rocks in a crude monument. Sweat beaded on his face, pouring into his eyes, dripping from his short hair. His breaths came in labored gasps, and his legs and arms felt as feeble as grass by the time a thin line of gold started to illuminate the clouds above him. Olifur placed the final stone and fell to the ground in an exhausted stupor. The world around him moved. The sun rose, the wind blew, birds sang, but Olifur was unconscious of it all. His body ached, and his soul wailed, a long, continuous, unceasing lament that he no longer had any tears to express. He closed his eyes and slept. When he awoke, dark clouds had rolled across the sky, threatening a storm. He had no idea how long he had slept. He felt as heavy and stiff as the stones he had moved. Olifur hugged his elephant and huddled closer to his parents' cairn. Hunger gnawed at his belly. He had never really been hungry before, not like this. And now the anguish of genuine hunger and thirst made him curl up into a ball. He longed for a sip of water, but did not know where to find any. A twig nearby cracked, and Olifur's heart raced. The bandit's parting comment about grimstalkers drifted through his thoughts, and he leaped up and dashed to the base of the cliff where he ducked behind the nearest boulder, clutching his elephant to his chest and silently begging the builder to care about him for just a moment. He peeked out over a boulder and then ducked back down with a terrified gasp. Green eyes gleamed in the trees, growing steadily larger.
"Builder, please,"
the child whimpered, unable to keep the sound from escaping his lips. The enormous cat emerged from the forest. Its huge paws patted softly, barely making a sound as it stalked closer. Its eyes blazed like green fire, and its mouth hung open, revealing sharp teeth. Muscles rippled beneath silky gray fur. Fear quaked through him as Olifur peeked through the rocks, heart thumping as though it might burst from his chest. But the massive beast did not seem to notice him. A tall man swung down from the cat's back, and Olifur's eyes widened in surprise. What sort of man could tame and ride a grimstalker? "What have we here?" the man muttered. He strode up to the pile of rocks, tilting his head this way and that as he circled the crude cairn. He knelt down near the edge of the construction, stretching out a hand as if to pick up one of the stones. Olifur burst out from behind his boulder.
"Don't you touch them!"
he screamed, anger overwhelming his fear, though he kept himself as far as he could from the creature.
"Leave them alone!"
The man reared back, his eyes widening at the sight of the small boy. "I don't mean any harm, lad." His voice was rough but kind. He stared thoughtfully at the child for a long moment. Then he dropped his gaze to the stones, his eyes flicking back and forth between the small boy and the rough cairn. After a long moment, he spoke again. "These your parents?" Olifur glared at the man.
"Yes, you leave them alone!"
The man glanced up and down the road, but stayed kneeling, inspecting the construction of the tomb. Olifur studied the man warily. A tattered cloak hung from broad shoulders. He had large, muscular arms that were banded with leather straps. Leather bracers adorned both his wrists. Wild black hair and a bushy dark beard, both streaked with a generous helping of gray, adorned the man's head and face. Dark blue eyes peered out from a weather-beaten and sun-darkened face. At least he wasn't a grimstalker. But was this man another bandit? He carried a longbow with a quiver of arrows slung over his back, and Olifur glimpsed a hatchet and a dagger hanging from his belt. The boy shuddered at the sight of the weapons, remembering the flash of sunlight on steel and pools of crimson. The man's gaze now moved to Olifur. "You build this?" He gestured at the cairn. Olifur nodded, tears trickling down his face once more. He was too tired to be afraid of the man, too hungry and heart-sore to feel much of anything.
Were you heading to Melar?
Olifur gulped.
Yes, sir.
Family there?
Olifur shook his head.
Healers for my mamma.
The tears returned in earnest.
Bandits attacked us.
The man stood, stretched, and stared up at the cloudy sky. The breeze picked up, and they could hear a distant rumble of thunder. Olifur shivered and gave a low whimper. The man scowled down at him.
Stop your crying, and come along with me, if you've a mind to.
He stomped away, not following the road, but plunging back into the woods. The Grimstalker paced beside him, its tail flicking back and forth. Olifur hesitated for a moment, uncertain. The man might be a villain, but he had made no threatening movements. Despite his rough appearance and gruff words, he had somehow seemed kind, and he was an adult who might have access to food and water. Olifur waffled, loath to leave this spot, the last tie to his home and parents. And yet he could not survive here, alone. Another rumble of thunder, this one louder and closer, decided him. Olifur, squeezing his stuffed animal tightly with one arm, darted into the trees after the man. Olifur had to jog to catch up, but he warily stayed behind the man, who did not slow his pace. They did not follow any kind of noticeable trail, and Olifur found it difficult to keep up. He kept stumbling over roots and getting tangled up in vines. The man tromped ahead, never looking back to make sure Olifur could keep up, never offering a word of encouragement or a hand of help, just winding his way through the forest with unwavering confidence. The enormous cat followed sedately, also taking no notice of the small person following their trail. Olifur struggled to move his weary legs, forcing his body to keep going. If he let the man out of his sight, he would be hopelessly lost. The fear of wandering through the dark forest alone until a wild beast found and ate him was the only thing that kept him moving. The long hours of weary labor, the short sleep, the lack of food or water, all combined to drag at his muscles and prick the backs of his eyes. But the man had ordered him to stop crying, so Olifur valiantly held back his tears. At long last, they reached a clearing, and the man stopped, gesturing grandly. "Home," he barked. Olifur stared. In the center of the glade stood a massive fireplace, open on both sides and built of stone. A large fire blazed, the smoke traveling up the large chimney. Worn patchwork hammocks hung between immense trees that circled the clearing. High in the branches, someone had strung a tattered canopy above the hammocks, a poor protection from the elements. Off to one side stood two structures, a simple log cabin with a thatched roof, and a much smaller, narrower sort of house with walls made of planks, and a roof covered in slats of wood with a stovepipe sticking out of it. A smokehouse, Olifur realized, recognizing it as similar to the one his papa had built back home.
"The lads'll make you welcome," the man said. "Lorcan, come welcome our new friend."
Without another word, the older man turned and strode back into the forest. Olifur stared after him with wide eyes, wondering what he was supposed to do now.
"What's your name? Your name?"
The friendly, if somewhat strange, words startled Olifur, and he turned to look up into the hazel eyes of an older boy.
"Olifur."
He squeezed his stuffed animal tightly.
"Hey, Olifur, I'm Lorcan. Welcome to Fritjof's Glen. Fritjof's Glen. First thing to do. Must do the first things first. We better find you a hammock. Come along."
The older boy trotted away toward the trees, and Olifur followed him slowly, his head spinning. They reached the trees, and Lorcan eyed Olifur dubiously.
"You're pretty small. Hoy, Callan, give me a hand here. First thing first, we need to lower one of the empty hammocks for Olifur here. Olifur is our new friend."
A dark, curly head popped up from a hammock, quite a ways off the ground, and brown eyes peered down at Olifur.
"A new friend? Where'd Fritjof find him?"
Lorcan shrugged.
"You know Fritjof. Not much for talking. Not much at all. Come on down and you can ask him yourself."
The boy, nearly as small as Olifur himself, swung himself easily out of the hammock and spiraled down a rope that Olifur hadn't even noticed hanging from a branch high above. He landed lightly on the ground and slung an arm around Olifur's shoulders.
"I'm Kellen. What's your story?"
Olifur's eyes stung.
"My parents were killed."
Kellen gave a shrug of one shoulder.
"Well, of course they were. All of us here are orphans, even Fritjof."
Olifur sniffled.
"Leave him be, Kellen,"
Lorcan said gruffly.
"Help me move this hammock closer to the ground, won't you? Must be closer to the ground. Don't want young Olifur to fall out and break his neck tonight. No more new friend then."
Kellen nodded cheerfully, and together the two boys made quick work of lowering the hammock and securing it.
"You can keep any of your own belongings in your hammock,"
Kellen told Olifur.
"Nobody here will touch anything in another boy's hammock."
"That's the second rule. Fritjof says that the builder frowns on stealing,"
Lorcan said.
"The rules are important. There are rules. Rules are good. I have to get some more firewood, and the others will be back soon. Kellen, you keep an eye on our new friend?"
Kellen nodded amiably as Lorcan left.
"He's different,"
Olifur said, watching the older boy go.
"A bit,"
Kellen agreed amiably.
"His brain works too fast, Fritjof says. But he's steady with his work. He's a stickler for the rules, but he's a good sort, even if all his hens are at home."
Olifur squeezed his elephant, then placed it carefully in the hammock.
"How many rules are there?"
he asked.
"Just 2,
Kellen said.
"What's the first rule, then?"
Olifur asked.
"If you want to eat, you pull your weight,"
Kellen replied.
"The first night you're a guest. If you want to stay longer, you have to work."
"What kind of work?"
Olifur asked, wondering if it involved climbing around in the trees some more. He kind of wished that the two older boys hadn't moved his hammock quite so close to the ground. He liked to climb, and the idea of sleeping up in the trees seemed interesting, and safer from grimstalkers.
"Oh, all kinds,"
Kellen shrugged.
"Hunting, cooking, cleaning up, that sort of thing. Keeping the cabin fixed up, watching the fire. But don't worry, Fritjof will teach you everything you need to know. Just make sure you listen good, because he doesn't talk much, and he never gives instructions twice. You're supposed to pay attention the first time."
Olifur nodded earnestly.
"You tired?"
Kellen asked. Olifur nodded. His entire body still ached from the long night of work, and his feet were sore after the long hike trying to keep up with his new benefactor. His stomach rumbled loudly.
"Hungry, too?"
Kellen grinned.
"Yeah."
He pulled a chunk of dried meat from his pocket and offered it to Olifur.
"Fritjof will be back soon with dinner, but this will help for now. You should try out your hammock."
Grateful to the other boy for his generosity, Olifur took the proffered meat and clambered into the hammock, which promptly flipped over and dumped him on the ground. He lay on his back, a little stunned at first. Kellen's grinning face appeared above him.
"They can be a little tricky at first. That's why we all start out close to the ground,"
the other boy said, holding out a hand to help Olifur back to his feet.
"You'll get the hang of it. Try again."
This time, Olifur got himself into the swinging contraption without knocking his breath from his lungs. He lay on his back, the hammock swinging slightly.
"Comfortable?"
Kellen asked. Olifur nodded.
"Good. I'm just a row up if you need something. We usually sleep in the hammocks. The cabin is just for bad weather, but it's pretty cramped with all of us in there. And the weather in this part of Turin is usually pretty nice. Thought it was going to storm earlier, but it seems to have blown over."
Kellen's face disappeared, and Olifur munched on the dried meat, staring up at the branches overhead, his elephant clutched in his arm once more. Despite the precarious nature of the hammock and the lack of walls or a roof, Olifur felt safe for the first time in 2 days. The bright green of the leaves mesmerized him, as he swayed back and forth beneath them. The gentle rocking lulled him into a drowsy contentment, and he slowly let his eyelids flutter closed. Chapter 3. Fritjof's Glen. Olifur startled awake and lay blinking up at the branches, wondering where he was. All the events of the previous day crashed over him. Grief gripped him tightly, like a giant claw pressing down on his chest. He gulped through his sobs, trying not to make any noise or draw any attention to himself. Wrapping his arms around himself, Olifur burrowed under his blanket, hiccuping through tears that seemed like they could never end. A gentle breeze ruffled through his hair like a caress, and Olifur quietly cried himself back to sleep. When he next awoke, it was to a commotion outside his hammock. Its eruption drowned out even his own thoughts. With some effort, he lifted himself to his knees. It was a wobbly business, but he managed it, and peeked over the edge of his new bed. His eyes felt swollen and gritty, and a tight rawness scratched at his throat as he swallowed. Through groggy eyes, he looked out upon the glen. The sun seemed to be settling down behind the trees, and a large fire blazed in the great stone fireplace, casting a warm glow across the little clearing. Fritjof had returned, and with him were about a dozen boys of various sizes. They capered about as he swung a large deer down from his shoulders. Olifur blinked as everyone set to work. Each child, from the largest to the smallest, seemed to have some pre-assigned role in preparing the meal. Olifur spotted the familiar curly hair of Callan, and watched as the boy went over to Fritjof and started speaking. They were too far away for Olifur to hear any of the words, but Fritjof appeared to listen intently, nodding as the boy spoke. They both glanced his way, and Olifur ducked down into his hammock, hoping he hadn't been noticed. A moment later, Callan's face peeked over the folds of the hammock.
"I thought I saw you waking up over here," the boy said cheerfully. "Come on, everyone wants to meet you. Bet you're hungry, eh?"
Olifur tried to press himself deeper into the hammock, shaking his head in sudden shyness, but then his own stomach turned traitorous, rumbling loudly. Callan reached down and grabbed Olifur's arm, pulling him up and tipping the hammock until it dumped him out.
"There's nothing to be afraid of,"
Callan assured him.
"It's all a little overwhelming at first, I know, but you'll soon feel at home. Being a guest is the hardest. Once you join the family, you always know what your job is and things. No sitting around feeling awkward anymore. There's always work to be done."
Olifur allowed himself to be pulled closer to the fire, into the throng of boys. Most were older than him. They greeted him with good humor, introducing themselves in a cacophony of names and faces that swam before his eyes. Surely he would never remember which faces went with which names. He gave his own name several times, and told his story more than once, before Fritjof finally intervened. "Quit badgering him," the old man barked. He pushed Olifur down onto a log, not unkindly, and waved the long wooden ladle he was using to stir the venison stew that the boys had made. "Get our guest a bowl, lads. Can't you see he's about to fall over from hunger?" Someone thrust a crude wooden bowl into Olifur's hands, along with a flattened stick that he guessed was supposed to be a spoon. Fritjof ladled a thick, hearty stew into his bowl, and then the other boys lined up for their own food, becoming an orderly line, as if by some unseen magic. Olifur sat on the log in a daze and stared down at his bowl. The idea of stew perplexed him. His parents had not been wealthy, and though his family had never gone hungry, their fare had been simple. He had been used to porridge and eggs for most meals, or perhaps toast with some of his mother's preserves. Occasionally she would roast a chicken, but that had been before she had gotten sick. His eyes burned as he thought of his parents. Swiping the back of his hand across his face to hide his sudden tears, Olifur took a large bite of the stew. The first sip burned Olifur's tongue, but he was so hungry he barely noticed. The pangs of hunger had long since subsided, but at that first taste of food they returned with roaring force. Within seconds he had gulped down the entire bowlful. The other boys sat around on logs, eating at a more sedate pace, and talking and joking with one another. Olifur stared at the stew pot longingly, his stomach clenched, still ravenously hungry. Fritjof sat silently apart from the boys, his eyes drifting about the clearing with a sort of watchful alertness, his own bowl held loosely as he spooned stew into his own mouth. Gathering up all the courage he had ever possessed, Olifur forced himself to stand. Slowly he crossed the short distance that felt like miles, and stood before the man who had rescued him. Fritjof cocked his head to one side, staring down at him expectantly. Olifur opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "Well?" Fritjof prompted, after a long silence. Olifur licked his lips and gave a small croak.
"Please, sir."
His voice came out in a thin, wavering stream.
"May I have some more?"
Fritjof's face broke into a wide, beaming smile.
"Like our stew, do you?"
Olifur nodded. The man snatched Olifur's bowl from his hands and ushered him to the fire. He ladled several hearty spoonfuls into the bowl and handed it back.
"By all means, have as much as you like."
"Thank you,"
Olifur said.
"Welcome,"
Fritjof grunted. He eyed Olifur.
"Melar is only about 15 miles north of here. You say you don't have any family there?"
Olifur shook his head. He savored the warmth of the stew. "Where are you from?" Olifur squinted.
"Mjolvar."
"That far?"
Fritjof's eyebrows rose.
"That's a long way to travel."
"Mama was sick,"
Olifur explained.
"The healers near us couldn't do anything for her, but they said there was a physician in Melar who could help."
"You have any family back in Mjolvar? Friends you might want to stay with?"
Olifur shook his head again.
"No, sir."
Fritjof stared at him.
"Well, you can stay with us if you like, or I can take you into Melar and try to find you an apprenticeship if you'd rather."
A wave of panic washed through Olifur at the thought of leaving. Fritjof seemed gruff and hard, but he had also been kind.